Welcome everyone. My name is Laura Zurowski. I am a writer and a photographer who lives in Pittsburgh. I moved to Pittsburgh 11 years ago. I'm originally from Providence, Rhode Island, another P, post-industrial city. And 7 years ago, I became really fascinated and I might even say obsessed with the city steps. And part of this is because in Rhode Island, we're on the ocean and it's very flat. and moving to Pittsburgh, the terrain is just so different here. I was completely astounded by just how hilly and how steep so many of the streets are and so many of the neighborhoods. And as I started to move around the city and walk around and explore new places, I started to see these public stairways that connected one street to another, often on these, very unruly hillsides. And I started to wonder what this was all about. And so that started my quest to go out and visit all of the 739 public stairs that the city of Pittsburgh has. And I was taking photographs of them using an old Polaroid camera, and then using the social media platform Instagram to share my photos and my stories that I was writing about all of these different neighborhoods that I was visiting throughout Pittsburgh. And so that project took me a little over 6 years to complete. And at the completion of that project, I have started writing a book about Pittsburgh's public stairways, including lots of new walking tours all over Pittsburgh. And that book will be coming out in May of next year. So the talk that I want to give this evening, a lot of the information that I'm going to talk about tonight can be found in the book that is coming up, but the book has so much more too. But this is just a really nice overview of some of the really interesting history of Pittsburgh's city stairs, because they're more than just stairs. Right? There's a really big reason why the city built all of these and why they have survived for so very long. So the reason why we have public stairs, we have city steps in Pittsburgh, is because of the landscape, right? You all live here, you know, it is really hilly. And this particular map that we are showing right now is a topographical map of Pittsburgh. And so you can see here the confluence of the three rivers, the Ohio, the Allegheny, and the Monongahela. And with this region, as you can see here on the map, the redder the color, the higher the elevation is. And what makes Pittsburgh so unique compared to other urban areas is that the difference between the highs and the lows in some places can be up to 660 feet difference. So very, very steep hillsides, cliff faces that go down. And all of this topography that we have is the result of erosion that happened a very, very long time ago, back when glaciers had covered this area. If you've ever driven through neighborhoods or walked through neighborhoods like Carrick or Brookline, Beachview, you know those city streets are they're kind of like a roller coaster. They just go up and down and up and down. And the terrain is very unruly. So within the city of Pittsburgh, the city has 90 distinct neighborhoods that are spread out between the four quadrants: the north side, the South Hills, the West End, and the East End. And this map that you're looking at here is kind of a line drawing of a map of the city of Pittsburgh that shows where the different neighborhood lines are. And the red dots that you can see on the map show the locations of where the city steps are located. Back to areas in the South Hills, the South Side slopes, as well as lots of areas on the north side, Fineview, Troy Hill, Perry North and South, Brighton Heights, And then also scattered throughout the East End as well. There are many neighborhoods in the East End section of Pittsburgh that have lots of city steps. And these city steps that are on this particular map here, this shows the location of the concrete and steel city steps that were built after World War II. And they built almost 800 flights of stairs in all of those years. The city steps that we see in Pittsburgh today were built in the years following World War II. But there were city steps in Pittsburgh for years, decades before all of that. And many of those city stairs, we don't see them anymore. However, one way that we know about some of their locations is something called the Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps. And so the fire insurance maps were used by cities all over the United States in the 1800s. And they were exceptionally important because when we think about that particular period of time, particularly after the Civil War, one of the biggest risks that city dwellers had was the risk of fire, right? There were catastrophic fires that Pittsburgh experienced, but also Chicago, New York City, and that's because so much of what was built out of wood, and people were heating their homes with, open flames and things like that. So there was a lot of opportunity for destruction. However, the oldest insurance map that shows city steps dates to 1884. And as I said, that is not the 1884 map that is there, but that is the first map that actually shows on a map a flight of where the city stairs are. So while the Sanborn fire insurance maps go back a long ways, the City of Pittsburgh City Archives actually has some slightly older information. Now, the City of Pittsburgh Archives is a relatively new office for City of Pittsburgh government. It was created 5 years ago. And you can only imagine the amount of work the 3 archivists that work for the city in the archives department have, because they are going through over 150 years worth of documentation, all sorts of records, all sorts of plans, drawings, designs, things that came to fruition, plans that never came to be. But one of the benefits of the city now having an archive that is staffed by professional archivists and researchers is that it is easy for historians, anyone who is curious and wants to know something about old Pittsburgh city government history, to go online and ask a question. And a question I asked a little over a year ago was, okay, in the archives, are there any records? When did the city of Pittsburgh actually start getting into the business of building the public stairs, the city steps? The city began building the city steps in 1870. So that predates the Sanborn fire insurance map. And this first flight of stairs was built in Boyd's Hill. That is in the Uptown area. And this flight of stairs was built pretty much where Duquesne University is located now, the main campus up there in Uptown. And that's where the first flight of stairs was built by the city of Pittsburgh. And then starting in 1873, construction really began in earnest. Now, it's important to note that when the city began constructing city steps, one of the first places they really focused on was the south side slopes. And this was so important back in the late 1800s because the south side at that time was known as the workshop of the world. There was so much industry that was happening in the south side. People think, yes, they think J&L Steel and the steel industry, But even predating that, throughout the 1800s, the South Side was really the birthplace of the glass industry. So much glass was made on the South Side. There are actually several presidential administrations from the 1800s that glassware that was served and used at the White House came from Birmingham, now known as the South Side in Pittsburgh, but because of all of that industry. So the South Side was an area that had lots and lots of people, had lots of industry that lined the Monongahela, and once again, it's about transporting people who live up in the hills to the industry that lines the rivers. So having city steps to connect all of those people that were moving to this area from other parts of the United States as well as from all parts of Europe was really essential. So, here's a photo here. We like to talk about the good old days, right? So here we are, City Steps 1.0. This is the good old days. So the photo that you're looking at here is it's right off of West Carson Street, and this is the big hill that leads up to Mount Washington, Duquesne Heights. And Grandview Avenue, today's Grandview Avenue would be at the very top of this. And this was called the Indian Trail Steps. Now this flight has not existed for a long time, and in fact it was only around for not even 20 years, a little over 20 years. And this was the longest flight of city steps that was ever built in Pittsburgh. It stretched over a mile long and had more than 1,000 individual steps on it. It is something that people look at that and they think, wow, imagine walking up and down that all the time. However, you really have to imagine what life was like before that got built, because the fact is that people were walking up and down that trail on the hillside for decades beforehand. And as people continued to come here, that trail was used more and more. Now you can only imagine, in looking at that hillside and thinking about the amount of snow and rain that, we don't get quite so well. We get a lot of rain. We don't get so much snow anymore. But you can only imagine 100+ years ago, you live up in Mount Washington and you're working in industry. You're working at a mill down below. And before these stairs existed, you're traveling up and down that trail on that super steep, really dangerous hillside. So as the city steps move along, so as the city starts building all of these wooden public stairways, starting in the 1870s, and once the city starts getting into the business of building city steps, every neighborhood that has hills wants them. And so you have several decades where the city is building stairs all over the place. There are hundreds of flights. However, the stairs were made out of wood. So it's important to note that, as we all know, wood doesn't last forever. And especially when we're thinking about the wood that was used 100+ years ago, we're not talking about like the special pressure-treated, insecticide-laden wood, right, that we have today for building decks and porches and things like that. This was rough-hewn lumber that was also very easy for people when times were tough and the weather was cold to rip up a couple of boards here or there and take them home and throw them in the fire to try to keep their home and their family warm. So as time went on and we start to get into like the tough times of the Depression, so we're looking at like the late 1920s, early 1930s, things were really starting to go bad with the stairs. But of course the city had built all of these stairs, but now they were stuck in this situation where it's like, okay, times are tough, people are out of work, the mills are laying off people, there's a lot of hardship, the city doesn't have as much money, we're having a hard time repairing things. And so, there was some repair work that was done. There were some beautiful flights of city stairs that were constructed during that time, particularly in places like Shenley Park. If you can think about times when you've been in the park, there's some beautiful granite and stone stairways that have been built along with beautiful retaining walls. Many of those were built at that time, putting people to work and doing all of the landscaping in those areas. However, you know, as soon as we have the Depression, and then now we start coming into World War II. And so many of the men that lived here went off to fight the war. So departments such as Public Works, which was normally responsible for trying to maintain infrastructure, is at a skeleton crew because there are the number of men that were in the city was at an all-time low. So the city steps, many of these wooden city steps really got into terrible, terrible shape. So by the time we come around to 1945, as World War II is coming into its final days, it was time to start campaigning for a new mayor in the city of Pittsburgh. And there was this a gentleman here. He was a very popular football coach at Carnegie Tech, which is now known as Carnegie Mellon University, CMU. His name was Robert Waddell. And he was a Republican mayoral candidate for the city of Pittsburgh. He was running against the Democrat whose name was David Lawrence. David Lawrence would go on to win, and later David Lawrence would go on to become governor of Pennsylvania. However, back in 1945, it was not completely clear who was going to win because Mr. Waddell was a real populist working class figure, and he garnered a lot of publicity going out to neighborhoods where the city steps were in really tough shape. Now remember, the city steps were built primarily in very working class neighborhoods because they were designed to transport people in a very no-cost, affordable way. So as Waddell is going out into these neighborhoods, he's campaigning directly to that particular population and commiserated with folks saying that, oh, this is terrible that your stairs are in bad shape. How can you get to work? It's dangerous. It's dangerous for your kids walking to school. And the newspapers in the 1945 were really filled with a lot of his travels. And while he did run a very competitive race there, he did ultimately lose to David Lawrence, but he certainly gave Lawrence a run for his money. And it's not that Lawrence won completely hands down. Waddell, I believe, garnered 35% of the vote. So that's not insignificant. So, okay. So as World War II is coming to a close, the city realized it had a lot on its hands here. It realized, one, we have a large population of young men who are coming back from World War II who are going to need jobs. And there is going to be a lag between their returning to Pittsburgh and the steel mills, getting the contracts, doing everything, and being able to put people back to work. Also, the city realized that the general population of Pittsburgh had really reached its breaking point here in terms of having so many years of things just like being in really bad shape. So the city did a couple of things, and between 1945 and 1946, they started preparing for issuing several bonds. Which would ultimately be several millions of dollars in today's money that would then be put to work on all of these city step and other infrastructure projects, paving roads, repairing sidewalks, fixing retaining walls. And so starting in 1946, all of this really kind of like started with a bang. And people were very, very excited. And it's interesting to look back at newspapers from between 1946 and even 1952, 1953, and see that city steps, a new flight of city steps, often made the front page of the newspaper. and because people were so excited, it was a wonderful thing to see. And also, this is now coming into an era where the commoners' stairs were being made out of concrete and steel. Yes, there were still stairs that were being made out of wood in some areas, but the really big flights were just getting this complete overhaul and were really beautiful to look at. And if you see the scan of the article on the right-hand side, that is the St. Thomas Street stairs that's on the south side. It's right near Brosville, in that particular area, in the middle section of the south side slopes. And that flight of city steps still exists to today. It looks exactly as it does in the photo. So it must have been a very exciting time in the late 40s, early 50s, as all of this construction was taking place. So Pittsburgh has this big infrastructure boom. They're building everything for like 5-6 years. Sidewalks, retaining walls, city steps, all of this stuff starts happening. And of course, all of this was built using, sound building techniques, excellent materials. And the city steps at that time had an anticipated lifespan of approximately 70, 75 years, give or take. So for the first couple of decades, everything is totally fine. But then, we start to hit the 60s. And with the 60s, changes start coming to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh industry is still here, but by this time we've had the development of the highway system, the interstate system. We have the birthplace, the advent of suburbia, right? And cars start to become more ubiquitous. So people begin to leave Pittsburgh proper, moving out to the suburbs. So as in the 1950 census, there were 700,000 people that lived within the city of Pittsburgh proper. Just the city, never mind Allegheny County, just the city of Pittsburgh. Today, the city of Pittsburgh has a little under 300,000. So that's important to note because in the heyday, post-World War II, infrastructure was built for 700,000 people. Today, we have 300,000. And life's changed in so many ways that was so different from 100 years earlier when Pittsburgh was really, all of this was being built. So as we come into the 1990s, this is the environment that Bob Regan came upon when he moved to Pittsburgh in the late 1990s to teach in the engineering school at Pitt. Now, Bob came to Pittsburgh because he was coming to teach a new technology that was coming out at that time, which was GIS, Geographical Information Systems. And that is where we take mapping technology and we take data and we kind of marry the two together. That's something that we kind of take for granted today because if you just turn on the news, you'll see all sorts of examples of maps that have data and information overlaid into it. But at the time, this was still a somewhat new and emerging field, and Bob Regan had come out here to teach at Pitt to teach students about this particular field. So Bob was, and still is, Bob is still alive, a very avid cyclist. And so he had, decided, okay, I'm gonna take my bike out and I'm gonna bike all around this new city that I'm living in. And as he started cycling around, he noticed the city steps. And he thought to himself, ooh, now this is interesting. This is a really interesting mapping problem because this city has roads that are actually stairs. So how do we incorporate that into a map so that people aren't trying to drive their cars on a flight of city stairs? And so what Bob did was, like most people would do, he, called up Public Works. He called up Town City Hall and said, I'm Professor Regan at the University of Pittsburgh. How do I get a map of where all the city steps are located? And of course, this was late 1990s Pittsburgh, which had a lot of economic problems on its hands. It did not have great record keeping. The city was, in financial crisis. It was just trying to keep everything afloat. And essentially the information that Bob received was, we don't really know where the stairs are because we can't maintain them. We have relinquished our responsibility. Like, there are some that Public Works takes care of, but we know in the past we built a lot of things and we have no idea where they are, and we don't really have the staff or the people that can help you with that. Maybe you should go to the library. And that is exactly what Bob did. So Bob went to the Carnegie Public Library and he went to the Heinz History Center and he started looking through the old maps, like the Sanborn fire insurance maps and other older street maps, to start to understand, okay, where were things built? He also, because he was an avid cyclist, had just decided, well, I'm just going to start biking all over the different streets of Pittsburgh. Because one thing, because he was a researcher and he recognized this, a lot of the city's stairs happen to connect with public transit routes. Right? The public transit routes are something that the county, because that's administered by Allegheny County, have great records about where all the bus stops are located. And many of those bus stops have been in place for a very long period of time. And public transportation has been in Allegheny County for a very long time. So Bob was able to determine that, if I start looking at where all the bus routes are, chances are I'm going to find some city steps near the bus stops. And that was a really great way to go about finding where all the stairs were. So for several years, Bob went out and just cycled all over the city, and being the engineer, took careful notes about where everything was and how it was constructed and how long the flight was, how many steps. And over his journeys, he chronicled 739 flights of stairs. Fortunately, in 2016, the city of Pittsburgh, with Bob's permission, acquired all of that data so that they could take it and actually put it on the city's website and give it to Public Works and everything, so that no longer would Pittsburgh say, oh, we don't know where the stairs are. So all of Bob's work back in the late 1990s and the early 2000s was really useful. So not only for the city of Pittsburgh, but also because he wrote this book, Pittsburgh Steps. And this is the book that I found back in 2017. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, I read the book and it was very interesting to me. And I thought, okay, all of this was written almost 20 years ago. Pittsburgh's changed a lot in 20 years. The city that Bob was riding around and exploring in the late 1990s was very different in many ways from the city that I had come to in 2015. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to recreate Bob's journey. So I am going to go and I am going to visit all of the stairs that Bob visited, but I'm not an engineer. I'm a writer, I'm a photographer. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to see what things are like now, and see what the neighborhoods are like now, and see what the stairs look like. And so that started me on my journey. So some of the things that are amazing to see, these are things that Bob witnessed back in the late 90s. These are things that I have witnessed and saw in the last 5 or 6 years. But some of the information here is just absolutely fascinating. And the first off is that Pittsburgh actually has 344 streets, legitimate streets that have street signs on them, that are really flights of stairs. And even when I moved here, 2015, 16, 17, there were still times I would get GPS on, I'm driving someplace, and I would still get directions, or I would still be told, turn left onto Diana Street, right? And Diana Street is on the right-hand side there, that big cantilevered flight. It's like, oh no, I can't turn left on Diana Street. Fortunately, because Pittsburgh does have a pretty big office for Google that's here, in more recent years, all of that has been corrected. And in fact, Google Maps now has great features where you can choose, are you driving, are you walking, are you cycling? And things like Google Maps will now give you directions so that if you indicate you are walking, it will take you up. Yeah, you can climb up the Diana Street stairs to get up there. But if you're in a car, nope, you got to keep going up Homer Street and turn around. So just a couple fascinating examples there of all of those streets. And today, much like, you know, everything that's old is new again, much like in the 1800s and early 1900s, where city steps were built out of wood, this is still the case today. The city still has approximately 90 flights that are made out of wood, and this is, of course, for the same reason. Flights of wooden stairs are relatively easy to make. They are also relatively inexpensive. Those concrete and steel flights can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, whereas a wooden flight can usually be made over the course of a week through a couple of people that work for Public Works. So the wooden steps do still exist. However, they are also, you know, still susceptible to all of the same damage that used to be done 100+ years ago. They do fall apart. Today, cars, delivery trucks, garbage trucks can sometimes bump into them. So, you know, they are definitely much more fragile. Another thing that you often see in Pittsburgh, too, are the sidewalk stairs. The city has almost 300 flights, 280 sidewalk flights. Often they are raised, just like the ones in that photo there to the left. That is in Mount Washington, a very hilly neighborhood. And the raised sidewalk flights just provide a safe place for people to walk because the streets are so very steep. So whether you're walking up or walking down, sometimes walking down a really steep street can also be extremely dangerous. And so you just having the sidewalk stairs along sides just makes it a little safer for folks. So miles and miles of stairs. So as we saw back at the very beginning, some of the earliest flights were built in the South Side slopes, and that neighborhood has the largest number of city steps of all of the 90 neighborhoods. The South Side slopes has 68 flights of stairs scattered throughout both I would say kind of like the northern part of the slopes and the southern part, which has a combined total of somewhere over 5,400 individual steps. It's pretty crazy. However, if you think about it, the fact that that neighborhood has so many stairs is not so crazy for two reasons. One, the elevation change there is crazy. But second, the South Side slopes, as I mentioned earlier, was a densely populated neighborhood throughout the 1800s into the 1900s, even before it was a part of Pittsburgh. You know, lots and lots of people that were, you know, coming to Pittsburgh, coming to this area, were living there because of the work that was along the river. And so because it was such a densely populated neighborhood and it was a very working class neighborhood, it made sense to have the city steps there because it really just helped to transport the workers from the hills to the mills that lined the rivers. Now today, the South Side slopes has certainly lost some population, but it is still a very popular neighborhood, particularly with young professionals, as well as some college students, because it is very close to Duquesne, it's very close to Pitt and Carlow, and much of the mill work that was done along the river has now given way to like entertainment and shopping and amenities. So there are, you know, restaurants and shopping and bars and clubs and all that kind of stuff. And so the neighborhood has maintained some of its population. And every year, this has now happened for 25 years, the South Side Slopes Neighborhood Association has sponsored an event called Step Trek. And what this is, it's a fundraiser. The Neighborhood Association is a nonprofit group. And this actually started during Mayor Tom Murphy's administration. And Tom Murphy actually presided at the very first Step Trek, and he led people on a tour of the South Side. And ever since then, this has been an annual event that brings people out. Everyone walks around the South Side. They get different walking tour maps, and it's a real fun thing. It happens the very first weekend of October. So it happened just about a month ago. Real fun time. So the next thing that is interesting that has happened here in Pittsburgh about the city stairs is something called orphan houses. And an orphan house, at least when it comes to houses on city steps, is not a house for orphans in the normal or the regular sense, which is, oh, orphans, you often think of children who don't have parents, right? An orphan house on the city stairs is a house that does not have street access, right? The only access that they have to the house is by the city steps. Now, when these houses were built, they tended to be built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the fact that they weren't on a street wasn't a bad thing. In fact, being on a flight of stairs, because they were also streets, could be seen as a good thing, because chances are you were going to be walking up and down that flight of stairs to get to work and do your daily shopping and all of these other things. And of course, back then, these were in working class neighborhoods where people typically were not going to have automobiles. So the fact that a house and living in a house that did not have immediate street access was not a deal breaker for a lot of people. However, as times change, right, as we move forward, as Pittsburgh experiences all this depopulation, as the world changes and people start having more and more cars, right? People start having more and more things in their house. And it's not to say that people back 100+ years ago didn't have things. They had things. They wanted nice furniture. Like, they wanted stuff in their house, right? People are people. Doesn't matter what year it is. But the way people acquired the goods that were in their house is very different than how we acquire them today. And so today, in the more modern world, having a house that does not have immediate street access is a real disadvantage. Now, it might not be a disadvantage if you're living in a high-density, high-population city like San Francisco or Los Angeles or Seattle, right? However, in a city like Pittsburgh that has more empty property, that has more empty abandoned homes, the orphan houses are really at a disadvantage. So the orphan houses were often places that, as Pittsburgh was shedding its population, the orphan houses often just became abandoned houses. So you can understand a family's situation where it's like, okay, you know, maybe mom or dad or grandma and grandpa, they live in this house, but children go off to college. They don't stay in Pittsburgh because it's the 1970s, it's the 1980s. There aren't as many jobs. They move on someplace else. In time, you know, people pass away, and Pittsburgh families found itself at a time when a home had no value, particularly houses that didn't have street access. So many times families would simply walk away from a house because they couldn't even begin to sell it because, like, there was no value. There was no one that was interested in buying it. So many of these properties simply became abandoned, and then in time the city would gradually come along and demolish them. Demolishing houses costs an awful lot of money, so the city can't just go and demolish everything in one swoop. Every year they kind of have a list and they have a budget, and it's like, okay, how many properties can we demolish this particular year? So this is the fate of many orphan houses. There are still orphan houses in places like the South Side Slopes because those young people and those college kids, you know, it's like they just want to be in that neighborhood. So it doesn't matter that they've got to go up and down a flight of stairs to get there. But for many other places, the orphan houses no longer exist. And for this particular photo that you see here, this is a street view, a Google Maps street view screen capture that I did on my computer. And this is, what's it called? Lamont Street. It's in California Kirkbride on the north side. And so this is a street view capture from 2011. However, 2 years later, this house and the wooden stairs along it were demolished by the city. So if you were to go out to Lamont Street today, you don't see anything. You see a hillside that is there, but this particular image is gone. And I just have to say, for people who are doing research, you know, Pittsburgh has had so much change in its building landscape, that Google Street View is a really great tool, because Google started capturing street view images around 2007, 2008. And not every street, but there are areas that the photo documentation goes back that long. And it is really interesting, because sometimes if you're looking for a building, a flight of stairs, a street that you can't find today, like it's completely gone, going onto Street View and navigating around can actually bring up an image, kind of ghostly like, but it's something that like you don't see it today, and there might not be any sort of record of it anywhere else. So Google Street View is a really interesting tool, just to kind of see how streets and neighborhoods have changed over time, because there's been a lot of change in Pittsburgh over the last 10, 15 years. So another thing that's really interesting here is the state of some of the city steps. So this particular slide and these photos that are here are of Rising Main, and this is in Fineview up on the north side. Rising Main is considered one of the longest flights in Pittsburgh. If you're driving on the thruway north out of Pittsburgh, and it's wintertime, kind of like we're into right now as the greenery starts to die back, you can see this majestic flight etched into the hillside. It is enormous. It's 331 individual steps. And one of the things that this flight was originally built, because where the thruway is now used to be a neighborhood. It was called the East Street Valley neighborhood, and it was in that valley connecting on the north side, Fineview, also known as Nunnery Hill, to Spring Garden and Spring Hill City View, which is the other hilltop neighborhood on the other side. And the East Street Valley neighborhood was a very vibrant one. It had lots of industry. It had a large soap factory that employed lots of people. And this is why flights like Rising Main were constructed, because it was designed to carry people who lived up in Fineview or Nunnery Hill down to the East Street Valley neighborhood, which was much more commercial, industry, stores and whatnot. And so the flight of stairs existed. Now, of course, that is all, history for the history books. Today, we have a highway that goes through that area. The East Street Valley neighborhood, that's an area that you can go online if you're curious about it. There's a number of people that have written about it. But most of the neighborhood was seized by eminent domain by the state of Pennsylvania, as well as the city and the county, to build the highway. But this is an area now that is pretty much, there's a few houses that are left, but Rising Main goes down to the end of a street, and then the highway is right at the very end of it. So as a result of that, it's a place that is kind of like it's cut off. It's a little bit abandoned, People that live in Fineview, however, do still like to walk on Rising Main. It is still a popular spot for exercise. You got to be a little careful because, as you can see from the photo, the flight has unfortunately developed a case of scoliosis. As you can see, it's a little twisted and turned around there. And that is in part because of the erosion that has taken place on the hillside. However, it's still a very popular spot for people to walk dogs, people to exercise. The Fineview Neighborhood Association has a steps challenge that happens at the beginning of every October, and people still run up and down Rising Main, those crazy runners. And this is an example of a flight of stairs that is certainly historically significant. And significant in the sense of that it's an amazing piece of construction and engineering. However, when it comes to, well, geez, you know, they should fix it. Like, it's terrible that it looks that way. The fact is that this is probably a flight that will never be repaired, just simply because it no longer goes anywhere. It is there, it goes to the end of the street. There's a dead end, the highway is on the other side. And so it is something that I do tell people, it's like, it's great, you know, particularly this time of year as the greenery dies back, to go take a look at it. If you're hardy in hail, you know, get out there and climb, you know, climb around on it, see what is there, because this is a flight that as the hillside continues to erode, so will the warp in the concrete. It will continue to become more structurally unsound. And at some point, a segment of it will completely fall out. And at that point, the flight will be closed. But there's always hope. I always think, like, you know, maybe there's got to be some sort of, like, Pittsburgh philanthropist or someone like Mark Cuban, like, come on, come and fix the stairs. You got all that money, right? One can only hope. So I don't want to end this talk on a sad note, orphan houses and stairs that are falling apart and whatnot, because today, in this day and age, we are actually coming into a new era where the city is trying, to the best of its ability, to take care of the city steps and to use its limited budget in a smart way to help neighborhoods stay connected, to help people stay connected to public transportation, and keep the flow of people, you know, moving around. For those folks that you know, that maybe don't want to drive, that want to walk more, that want to cycle more, that want to use public transportation more, and trying to encourage people to do that. So there have been, over the last close to 10 years, starting in around like 2017, 2018, the city created a city steps plan, and that kind of gave some direction as to how the city was going to go about rebuilding and repairing flights of stairs. So this is a photo here of a flight in the Middle Hill, in the Hill District, in the East End, that was rebuilt in 2019. And this particular street connects further down to Center Ave, which is an avenue of hope, community redevelopment place where there's new housing that's being built, new business district is being created. And so the new city steps will help to support movement of people to and from that area. Also, another flight that recently got rebuilt. This is over on the north side. This is a flight of stairs, Chestnut Street, Vista Street. It's at the intersection of East Deutschtown, Spring Garden, and Spring Hill City View. This is a very long flight of stairs that sections of it had fallen out. The city had closed it. However, they discovered that people were continuing to use it because there was a bus stop at the bottom, and the street and the neighborhood up at the top, there was no other easy way to get down to the bus stop. So people were continuing to use this like kind of dangerous flight of stairs. So this was one that started being rebuilt. A lot of the work was done throughout COVID, and the new rebuild of it is somewhat similar to the old version, but with some great new enhancements. So the new flight of stairs has solar-powered LED lighting, which is really important because we know it gets dark out early, right? We're coming into winter. And when people are coming home from work or they're like, going out and about, they want to make sure that, a good bright street light is a good safety feature. And so having these stairs be very well lit helps with the safety aspect of it. This particular flight also, you can kind of see a little bit of it in the photo. There's a yellow track you can see lying on top of the stairs. That is actually a bike runnel, R-U-N-N-E-L. And what that is it's designed for people that are, moving around with their bike, where they can simply put the bike into the track, not riding the bike. They still have to walk the bike up or down the flight of stairs, but it just makes it a little bit easier. It keeps the cyclist from having to actually pick the bike up over their head, and it just allows them to use the flight of stairs in an easier way to get up and down the hillside. That's another very beautiful flight. Also, the sidewalk stairs are every year. There's a number of flights of sidewalk stairs that get repaired and rebuilt. This is in the East End. This is in Greenfield. And this new flight here also has a bike runnel on it. This one is embedded into the concrete. It's you can see there's a narrow track close to where you can see the stones. Those stones are there to help manage water runoff. And that track there is for someone, they can just put the wheels of their bike right in there and simply walk the bike up the flight of stairs. And then here I want to show some before and after photos of what an actual construction site looks like oftentimes when city steps are being repaired. So this was taken in 2022. This is in the South Hills neighborhood of Carrick, and this is Copperfield Avenue. Now, Copperfield Avenue is one of the steepest streets in Pittsburgh. It has a 23% grade. So it's kind of a challenge even to drive up or down it. But it is a street that has several flights of city steps on either side. And one thing that this particular street had, which is interesting, you can see here in the photos, is that it had, and this was built back in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s, is it had a brick, I think of it as kind of like a channel or a sluiceway that was designed to help with water runoff. People had different ideas about the best ways to do things back then. This is not how the city constructs things any longer. But at one point, this brick channel for water runoff was installed. However, over time, this just became a hot mess, honestly. It's like, it's a place where it attracts litter, weeds grow up in it, and it's not directing water at all. In fact, it's just probably only creating more of a hazard for people. And so in 2022, this was a flight that was on the city's list for fixing. And so Public Works and an outside contractor came in and dug everything up and put in new sidewalk steps, removed that brick channel, and instead use what engineering best practices now for water runoff, which is having these large stones that are set so that water can sink in there, along with very large drainage at the end of every block as opposed to being at the very end of the street, to help with all of the water runoff here. And this is a street that, as a result of building all of these new stairs on both sides, just everything looks so much nicer. The street is cleaner, just everything, the fresh new concrete, it makes every single home on this street look so much nicer and fresher and cleaner as a result of doing this. So work continues. Work is always continuing. Every year, Public Works and outside contractors are always out there trying to fix some of the sidewalk stairs and some of the freestanding stairs as well. So you've seen lots and lots of flights of city stairs here, learned a lot about things, and you might be wondering, okay, so we've seen all of this. This is fascinating. How can I get out there? How can I learn more? How can I, on a nice day, go out and have an adventure? And yes, how to have your own adventure. There are lots of great resources that are out there where you can learn about where the city steps are located, and you can also find different kinds of walking maps. The first thing that I always like to mention is the step trek routes. The South Side Slopes every year in October has their annual step trek, and one of the things that's so nice about it is that if you missed it, that's okay. They still make their maps and their routes available on their website. So you can go to southsideslopes.org, visit the Step Trek section of their website, and you can see all of their historic Step Trek routes. You can keep save them on your phone, you can print them out, and then you can go out and you can walk around the different routes on the south side. The South Side also has another route, which is the Historic Churches route of the South Side. And this is a walking tour which talks about the many, many churches of all different faiths that existed on the South Side. Some of those churches are no longer churches. They've been converted into condominiums or art spaces or all kinds of different things. But that particular walk gives you information about the history of all of those different churches on the South Side. There's also a resource here for the Fine View Fitness Trail. Rising Main, one of the longest flights that I showed you on a couple slides ago. The Fine View Fitness Trail includes Rising Main, and it takes you through lots of areas of Fine View, really beautiful views of the city. It's called Fine View for a reason. Also, you can go to my website, missteps.com. Under my resources tab, I have a page that lists all kinds of different walking tours, both guided walking tours and self-guided map-based tours. So there's all kinds of information you can find on my website. And then if you're just looking to have a map that shows where all the stairs are, that is now available on the City of Pittsburgh's website. All you have to do is go to pittsburghpa.gov and look for city steps, and there is an online map where you can kind of zoom in and you can see where all of the different flights of city stairs are located. And that can be really helpful because once you start to go out and walk around, take it from me, it's easy to get kind of obsessed, and you might start thinking like, well, I did that South Side walk and that was kind of fun, but what's in Beachview? And I want to go to Troy Hill. And that's just kind of how it all starts. Take it from me. It happened to me. It happened to Bob Regan. It's happened to many, many people, where once you start going out and investigating the neighborhoods and the city stairs, you do get a little obsessed and you want to go visit them all. You start walking through parks. You start, look, where are the stairs located? But fortunately now, there are all sorts of online resources that you can find out where they are. And so on that note, the presentation's coming to a close. Thank you so much.